Imagine this. A government claims an attack. The media amplifies it and the public reacts emotionally. All of a sudden, policies rush through that would have never been passed in peacetime or under more scrutiny. Now, this isn't speculation. It's not theory. It is documented history, time and time again. So let's give you one example. The Gulf of Tonkin Incident. It perfectly illustrates how the problem reaction solution method works in the real world. We have to go back to August 1964 and the Cold War's at its height. The United States is obsessed with stopping communism, not just militarily but ideologically, and Vietnam has become the next proxy battleground. And this isn't because the American public demanded it, but because elite planners believed it was necessary to stop this domino effect from occurring. On August the 2nd, the USS Maddox encountered a North Vietnamese gunboat in the Gulf of Tonkin. There's a brief exchange of fire with limited damage and minimal casualties. However, 2 days later on the 4th, an event occurs that changes everything. There's radar signals, sonar readings, reports of incoming torpedoes. Commanders believe that they're under attack. Washington's informed, and the media repeats these claims. But here's the truth. Now acknowledged even by US government records, the second attack never occurred. There was no confirmed enemy vessels. There was no wreckage, no damage. Later investigations revealed that there was misread signals, radar errors, intelligence assessments that quietly contradicted the official story but then were brushed under the carpet. And yet, within days, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, handing the president near blanket authority to wage war. There was no formal declaration, no meaningful debate, no public consent in advance. And this is where the pattern becomes clear. 1. The problem. A claimed external threat, in this case an attack on US forces. 2. The reaction. Fear, anger, patriotism. And with a media consensus, this produces political urgency. 3. The solution. Expanded executive power, always more power. Military escalation. A war the public never voted for or wanted. This wasn't an accident, it's a mechanism, and it works. And what followed was devastation. Over 58,000 American soldiers were killed. And here's the part that rarely gets talked about honestly. This was a war largely fought through conscription. Young men from working class and poorer backgrounds were drafted and sent to fight, while many from elite families found ways to avoid service altogether, through educational deferments, medical exemptions, or political connections. There were tens of thousands who refused to fight, resisted the draft, or fled the country. Worse still, some people decided to down tools while in country, and the Vietnamese didn't take kindly to that. And this is the type of... You can't force people to war if they're not going to fight. It leads to devastating consequences. On top of this, when many of the conscripts finally returned home, traumatised, injured and broken, they weren't welcomed as heroes. They were abused, insulted, in some cases at airports spat at by a public that's turned its anger on the very people who had been forced to fight a war that they didn't want to go to. On top of this, millions of Vietnamese civilians were killed, entire regions were devastated. And it was only decades later the truth quietly emerged, long after accountability didn't matter anymore. This isn't about the US or Vietnam. This is about how power operates. Because by the mid-20th century, global wars between major powers became too dangerous. Nuclear weapons had made total war suicidal. Mutually assured destruction meant that there would be no winners. So power adapted. Instead of world wars, we got regional conflicts. Instead of invasions, we get proxy wars. Instead of open conquest, you get destabilisation. And instead of bombs alone, you get policy, economics, information and pressure. Now this pattern, as I said, doesn't belong to one country. Because when we talk about intelligence agencies shaping narratives, this isn't just an American story. In the UK, we've seen it quite recently with the Iraq War. There was the so-called dodgy dossier, and this was based heavily on circular reporting, i.e. one person's made something up. That gets passed to one agency. They then reinforce their other source, which is actually the same guy, by using this new source, and so on and so on. And it's just recycled intelligence claims and unverified sources, and it was used to justify an illegal invasion. Now, this was promoted very aggressively by Alistair Campbell, the media strategist often celebrated nowadays by the political left and fronted politically by Tony Blair, who's the true power behind Keir Starmer right now. These people have committed heinous crimes in not so long ago. Claims about weapons of mass destruction were presented as fact. Caveats were stripped out. Doubts were buried. Dr. David Kelly killed himself in a lane. Public was told that there was no alternative. And we all know how that ended. No weapons of mass destruction, mass civilian casualties, regional collapse, and the consequences that we're clearly still living with today. This thinking didn't emerge in secret. Elite policy circles openly discuss it. Groups like I talked about the other day, the Council on Foreign Relations, they don't fire missiles, they shape strategic thinking. The Club of Rome openly talks about limits, sustainability and population pressure. The Fabian tradition promotes gradual managed change rather than sudden upheaval. Intelligence agencies don't invent ideology, they just serve it. They filter information, they frame threats, and they provide just enough certainty so that politicians can act, and just enough ambiguity to deny responsibility later. So let me ask you this calmly, rationally, and without accusation. If governments have fabricated or exaggerated attacks to justify war, if intelligence has been shaped to support predetermined outcomes, if elite institutions openly discuss population management and systemic control, and if global war is no longer viable because it risks nuclear annihilation, is it really unthinkable that destabilising regions, encouraging mass migration, and allowing unresolved cultural and religious tensions to grow, and managing public reaction through this crisis, this could be seen as an alternative method of steering societies towards the outcomes that they've chosen that we would never freely accept? Now, I'll caveat that by saying I'm not saying that's what's happening. I'm asking whether history gives us any reason to believe it couldn't. Because the Gulf of Tonkin, incident teaches us one thing that's essential. Power will lie. Intelligence will comply. The media will repeat it. And ordinary people, me and you, will pay the price. The Vietnam War began with a lie. The question is whether we've learned enough to recognise the pattern when it appears again. And that's the lesson of Tonkin, and a lesson that's never been more relevant than it is today.